And welcome back, everyone. It's been a great day so far, and it just keeps getting better and better, especially with this panel, which is, I think, the first we've done for the Masterclass, which is on AI and incident response. We might have touched on it last year, but so much has happened this year. So hopefully you're tuning into this one to see. I've heard AI mentioned in just about every other panel, so I'm really looking forward to this group. And we have an incredible group, an eclectic group. Starting us off is Jennifer Beckage, who is the Joan Jett of incident response, a partner and the founder of Beckage PLLC, a law firm exclusively dedicated to cyber, now in Austin, Texas, proving that you can have a global practice from anywhere if you have the brain power of Jen. She is a powerful and robust mix of technologist, lawyer, and spectacularly successful business person. And Beckage was not even her first company. She also founded a startup that developed internet-based programs and other cutting-edge web technologies for NASA's Kennedy Space Center to the Buffalo Bills and the Buffalo Sabres. She's not just an entrepreneur and pioneer, but also an extraordinarily courageous person of epic proportions. When facing the kind of dire cancer diagnosis Jennifer faced a few years back, most of us would crumble and give up, but not Jennifer. Jennifer fought and Jennifer won, a battle that most people, 90% or more in her position, lose. I did a Twitter space once with Jen, and she talked about how her diagnosis made her a fiercer client advocate, a more dedicated, trusted advisor, and someone who really believes it when she tells her client, we will get through this. So grateful to have you here today, Jen. And if you had a theme song, it would clearly be Stronger by Kelly Clarkson, because that's what you are, stronger than most everyone else on the planet. So welcome, Jen.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome. And next up is Beth George of Freshfields. What her bio will tell you is that she is a cyber superstar partner at Freshfields, where her practice focuses especially on IR, and she's taught cyber at Stanford, Berkeley, and NYU. But what you might not see from Beth's bio is that she's worked on cyber senior levels across the United States federal government, including the Department of Defense, National Security Division of DOJ, the FBI, on their own internal privacy and data security guidelines and policies, and also in the Office of the White House Counsel, helping to manage the OPM data breach. 4 different parts of the executive branch, the only one here today with that rare combination, and the only one today, I think, who's already served for the Biden administration as the Department of Defense's acting general counsel and principal deputy general counsel, where at the time that she joined up, she had a 1-year-old and it was in the middle of the pandemic, but she still answered the call. For great Game of Thrones fans, wait for it, Beth is what you get if you engaged Arya Stark and Brienne of Tarth and put them to work in IR. From this day until her last day. That's, for the Game of Thrones fans, you know what that quote. And for Beth's theme song, very tempting to select Beth from Kiss or Georgie Girl from The Seekers, but I realize that those tunes are way too okay boomer. So let's go with Roar from Katy Perry, because you just don't mess with Beth George. Welcome, Beth.
Thanks, John.
And next up is Sean Hoar. Sean is a partner and chair of the cyber team at Constangy, Brooks, Smith, and Prophete. Sean is an IR guy, pure and simple, possessing just about every cyber certification there is, which makes him almost as much of a technologist as he is a lawyer. Meanwhile, the only list longer than Sean's list of credentials and certifications is his list of awards and accolades. But what distinguishes Sean from many of us is he made his bones serving as the CHIP, the computer hacking intellectual property, for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Oregon, where he still practices today. And he was the main contact for the FBI, Secret Service, Homeland Security, for all types of systems intrusions and digital crime emergencies. He's been an adjunct for over a decade at Lewis and Clark Law School, served as executive director of the Financial Crimes and Digital Evidence Foundation for 22 years. He's the IR equivalent of Ed Sheeran meets Eric Clapton. And if he had a theme song, it would be Clapton's It's in the Way You Use It. And we are thrilled that he is here today. So welcome, Sean.
Thanks, John.
And last up is Paul Luehr. Simply stated, our next panelist, Paul, is one of the most experienced data breach lawyers on the planet. He's worked on just about every major data breach that has ever happened. Now he works at Manatt, handling data security and data privacy matters, with a specialization in the recent issue around AI, which is why I was very happy he agreed to do this panel. I first met Paul when I was at the SEC, and he was my counterpart at the FTC. We both ran our respective internet programs, and we worked cases together, and we became fast friends. What always impressed me about Paul was that he didn't just investigate cyber fraud. He took his cases to trial, where he was a cross between Jack McCoy of Law and Order, Ben Matlock of Matlock, and Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird. A bona fide courtroom trial lawyer, he loved it so much he went on to become an assistant U.S. attorney, and then he joined Strauss Friedberg as general counsel and managing director in Minnesota when it was a tiny startup breaking new ground on the juxtaposition of law, business, and cyber. Paul brings a special perspective, a consultant, a federal prosecutor, a trial lawyer, a regulator. It's a lot jam-packed into one person. And although Paul is absolutely one of the most benevolent souls anywhere, and anyone who knows him will tell you this, if he had a theme song, it would have to be Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, because despite his easygoing and warm demeanor, that's what Paul brings to the table for his clients. So welcome, Paul. Welcome, everyone. And I'll turn it over gladly to Beth George. And I can't wait to hear this panel.
Thanks, John, and thanks always for your amazing introductions. I think I show up just to hear them every year. So now we're going to tackle AI and IR. I think for many of us, at this conference, AI has become the sudden new sexy thing, and those of us that are just doing cybersecurity feel a little bit like we've been put to the background. But the reality is AI has been around for a really long time, and we're just seeing it used in different ways, in more public ways. It's advancing, and that's creating a different circumstance for us to tackle as incident responders. So I want to start the conversation by just level setting here. Jennifer, I wanted to ask you to sort of walk us through, what are we talking about when we talk about AI? What's machine learning? What's generative AI? How long has this been around, and sort of what's new?
No, thanks. I mean, AI is a really broad term, and I think many of us in the space, when we hear it, kind of cringe a little bit because it's so overly broad. What are we talking about when we talk about AI? Because there's a lot of different ways that and technologies and tools that we would think of when we talk about AI. So really, AI at its core is really using machines and computers to help simulate different human behavior or intelligence. So this could be, having a machine learn from a set of data to make predictions or reasoning. It can help with understanding language and providing responses. And it's really been around for a long time. I mean, I think it was in the late 1990s when IBM's Deep Blue defeated the chess champion. So, the use of different artificial intelligence technologies have been around for a while, and people have been talking and speaking about it for some time. And I think everyone just thought, well, this is when machines take over humanity and take our jobs. And this is, mythology. But ChatGPT came around, and then suddenly everyone's like, oh, okay, this is really here. And I think put AI on the forefront. So when we think about AI, we're really talking about data or some sort of information, and then some sort of rules or algorithms to allow the machine, to learn or perform certain functions. Machine learning is a term that many of you have probably heard, and Gen AI is probably, another term. They're very different, if you will. Machine learning is really about teaching a machine to make predictions based on the past or data that's submitted or on patterns that you can see in that information set. While Gen AI and Gen AI is, going to be more complex because it's going to be making new and original content based on patterns. So generative AI really kind of builds upon, what we have for machine learning. So traditional AI, would be like your Siri or your Alexa that you might have at home, or when, a site helps, prepare responses of what movies you might like. When we think about Gen AI, we're talking about things that might help create images or large language models or Copilot, where we've got some sort of code generation that's being used. But as it relates to the AI space, there's a lot of different things that AI can do, right? For the good and for the bad. Obviously threat actors are using artificial intelligence to create very unique types of threats, but also, individuals, companies are also using these tools to defend against them, right? We can look at log files faster. We can start to see anomalies quicker. We can start to make some predictions. It can speed up response and remediation to threats and vulnerabilities. But I'll stop there in case there's some follow-up questions. But at its core, Gen AI is here to stay, and we'll talk about, I'm sure, compliance and other issues concerning it later.
Yeah, Jennifer, I want to stay with you for just one more minute and talk a little bit about, let's talk about how generative AI has changed the threat landscape. There's been a few sort of high profile cases. There was a deep fake video that it resulted in probably the most interesting new version of business email compromise. There's been fake robocalls. Can you talk to us a little bit about how we're seeing the threat actors use generative AI?
Yeah, again, I like ChatGPT. I think some of this is just sort of now hitting mainstream news, but this has been going on for some time. Yes, you mentioned, the financial worker in China who wired a lot of money after, that deep fake video call. There's easy protections to put in place to prevent things like that from happening that don't cost any money, and it's all about authentication and training, right? Training is always really important. And we know that from cybersecurity. We're definitely seeing a lot more of use of artificial intelligence to create, not just video, but also voice. So it might be, a child's voice, your child's voice. It might be, your pastor, your spouse, calling and seeming like they're in some sort of hysteria and need you to wire money. Now that sometimes people might think, well, that just relates to an individual basis, right? Like an individual scam. But for companies, you have to think about this because threat actors could be using these methods to help put additional pressure on executives who are being faced with an extortion demand or some sort of ransomware demand. Also, these tools are really easy and they don't cost anything, or there's a nominal cost. So you don't have to know technology. You can be, a young student somewhere, right? And download these tools and create things to create a ton of havoc. So we don't just have to think about like state actors or traditional threat actors. Really, anyone can do this. We are, not just a couple more, definitely seeing, deep fakes for audio for voice authentication in the financial industry. We've seen, victims of, sexually explicit deep fakes like Taylor Swift. We're just going to see more and more of these to either get past, the controls in the organization to cause a breach, right? Like a financial wire transfer. Or again, to put more pressure on victims, the individual executives and their families and others, to pay those extortions. So lots to think about. But again, I don't want to end on a gloomy note. We also have a lot of AI tools on the cybersecurity side, that can help automate, identify, suspicious activity and things of that nature.
Thanks, Jennifer. And that's like a perfect pivot. I wanted to go over to you, Sean, to talk a little bit about how cybersecurity is becoming more difficult, but also how generative AI is enhancing cybersecurity. Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure. And when Jen was talking about some of the developments in AI and generative AI, I was thinking about, for some reason, home security. Let's put a new security system in, and you think about Alexa. You in the morning you wake up and say, Alexa, please play X, Y, and Z, and you've got a certain music genre. Well, generative AI would take that to the next step, where if you're waking up at a certain time every morning, Alexa's going to be there to greet you and make sure that the music starts to play before you get there, or start to recognize your footstep, your foot pattern, your pace, your gait. And all of a sudden that can become a security measure as well, because to the extent you have the same gait with the same weight tension on the floor that ultimately generates itself and is felt, if you will, by that mechanism, all of a sudden the door may open that might otherwise be locked. And then the bad guys, though, can mirror that and then become you, and then walk in your door without authentication because it's mirroring. They've figured out how to mirror your gait or wear something that looks like you and have the same physical characteristics. And when we take that brick and mortar and put it inside a cybersecurity framework, let's just say sometimes it can enhance cybersecurity by reproducing, if you will, duplicating our workforce, making sure that we're automating certain things like automating security patching, multiplying the resources that we might not otherwise have if we're maybe a smaller organization. But at the same time, it can make it more difficult because of the more sophisticated attacks we're seeing, the likelihood of larger volumes of attacks. So maybe a smaller in complexity But you multiply that by 20, 30, 40, or maybe 1,000, and it hits industry sectors very, very hard at the same time. Could be increasingly difficult for enterprise risk management when you look at all the different types of vulnerabilities that could be created simultaneously by a complex threat actor. And then also, to the extent that we're talking about code, and we're talking about very complex and possibly insecure code, it can make that much more difficult to maintain. So I guess I'm the kind of the Eeyore, if you will, of AI, and that I see clouds when we start to talk about it, and I get very concerned about it. Obviously, it's enabled some tremendous developments, and it will, I'm sure, in healthcare and technology and geothermal exploration, all kinds of different things. But my concern is that we've got to be very, very careful with regard to our cybersecurity.
Thanks, Sean. And Paul, I wanted to bring you in here to talk a little bit. One of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is my CISOs and what they're thinking about, what their lives are like. As much as my job has changed over the last year, their jobs are changed. More threats. Can you sort of bring us into our sort of main clients' perspectives? How's their job changing?
Yeah, it's becoming more difficult on some fronts, and in other areas, I think it's becoming easier or more manageable, but overall, certainly more complex. As Jen and Sean have already alluded to, on the adversary side, we're just dealing with a tougher adversary. Let's face it, we're all going to have jobs for a long time because this is an arms race. And sometimes we feel like the criminals are winning. And some of the things that CISOs are dealing with, for example, is just sheer volume. For example, I noticed the SlashNet, a cybersecurity firm, reported that they saw 1,000% increase in phishing emails, and in particular, credential stealing emails. We've seen a lot of these where they're throwing up that credential page that just looks exactly like a regular credential page. And they're also, at the same time, able to pull through the two-factor authentication that we thought was our silver bullet. But because of that authentication page, they're now tripping us up twice, not just with the username and password, but now they've got that session cookie, or some people call it a magic cookie, that allows the criminal to log in for a long time. And that's happening in droves. As I mentioned, SlashNet says it's up 1,000% between late 2022 and last year, late 2023. Really coterminous with when we saw a ChatGPT coming online. The threats are coming faster. Unfortunately, you can't make this stuff up. There are engines out there called like Evil GPT, where the bad guys can simply ask them to kick out a command, and it will create malicious code. And that's something that the CISOs have to deal with. Certainly more sophisticated. Talk about email for a second. And Jen alluded to this. They can now personalize an email based on your position, the profile that you're showing, excuse me, on LinkedIn, your geographic location, even referencing a local concert, for example. They've got that much context. And even your writing style, which is unique and different. And then once they're into the environment, they can use AI to defeat the defenses you have, or to pivot and say, that's where the treasure trove is. I'm going to go after that first. So they're moving much more quickly. And then the threats themselves are just different. We mentioned deep fakes that are unique to AI. But in addition, you've got things like poisoning of the foundation or training model. Think of it as a model that's set up to recognize stop signs, and all of a sudden the bad guys put in a green stop sign instead of a red one. And now the model is confused about what the reality is, and the predictions can be altered. So they have new things to worry about, and the job has definitely become more complex. But I'd like to take Sean and maybe play Winnie the Pooh to his Eeyore or Piglet, because it's not all doom and gloom. There are some things we can do, and we're also already seeing occurring in the workplace. Jen and Sean both mentioned, and in fact, Eun-Young from the previous panel mentioned, we're just able to identify anomalies much quicker. Why is Paul logging in the middle of the night? Well, Paul's a night owl. That's not unusual for Paul. Okay, lower the temperature. The biggest thing that I see happening already is people are tying their AI systems to their log analysis. They're hooking it up to something like SIM or Splunk. And we've all been there talking to a poor security manager who says, Paul, I've got a great tool. I can't keep up with all the alerts that are coming through. And now AI is helping us keep up and prioritize which ones the security managers actually should be digging into. Two last things that I think are kind of interesting and unique and fun about where this is going. One is on training. We're seeing some tools now developed where on training, the employee gets a just-in-time notice about anti-phishing techniques at the very same moment that it's identifying a malicious link and neutralizing it. It's not waiting 3 weeks, or it's not saying, oh, you shouldn't have clicked on that, a month ago. It's doing it really simultaneous with the identification of the problem. And I think that's very encouraging for our employees, because after all, they are our first line of defense. And then lastly, I think it's really important. We all know how badly old data can bite us. I actually did the stats on a couple of my historic cases, and I found that old, outdated data increased the number of victims by 70-fold in one of my cases and by 10-fold in another one of these cases. And fortunately now we're able to use AI to do a better job of data mapping. In the old days, it would take literally weeks for a crawler to go through, send an agent out to each server. The crawler would identify each file. You'd maybe get the metadata back after weeks of waiting for it. Now, with sophisticated AI and sampling techniques, they can go in within hours, sometimes minutes, and let you know what a data repository contains in terms of sensitive data, and even down to the age of that data. What's the average create date on this data? So now you can throw up a flag and say, why do we have data that's still sitting around since 1995? Can somebody please go out and hit the delete button on that? So yes, there are some things we definitely need to worry about, and CISOs are worried about. But fortunately, there are some tools coming into the hands of CISOs and their staff that I think will help us get ahead of the game. And as I always say, we really need to embrace the technology, because at the end of the day, we need to use technology to beat technology. If the bad guys are using it, we're going to need to use it too.
Can I add just one thing, Beth?
Yeah,
I agree
absolutely.
with everything Paul said. I think one additional thing that I've seen, and I think Paul kind of alluded on it, is really wrapping your arms around what everyone in the business is doing. So again, there's a lot of excitement, and it's hard for the CISO to know that HR is using a company that's using AI and they're not thinking about bias and they don't have the right contractual terms, or someone in IT is really excited about ChatGPT and decides to take a bunch of, real customer data and upload it, into that system. That toothpaste is out of the tube. So I think, we just finished data mapping, right? We're trying to keep our security or controls. We've got all these new privacy laws now. And now I've got to track down everyone who might be using AI. It's a big challenge, and it brings governance issues. Who's really going to own this at the organization? Is it the CISO's job to own AI fully? Are there other parts of the organization that should own that as well?
Yeah, Jen, and I'd like to give some props to Beth and her one big thing, because I think she was touching upon that. And I was thinking the same thing. And in fact, I've had success starting a brand new data governance unit using AI as my calling card. It's like, well, we're putting together this new group, and it's going to be talking about privacy, and it's going to be talking about cybersecurity. And since everybody's excited about AI, hey, everybody, why don't you tell us what you're doing? And all of a sudden, the last one I did, we got something like 60 emails within 3 days. And it's amazing what the employees are up to. Sometimes a little scary.
Yeah, let's talk about what the employees are up to a little bit. So I think perhaps one of the first alarming stories that we saw, let's pivot a little bit to sort of the legal regulatory atmosphere. It's one of the early stories that we all saw was Samsung's engineers having uploaded some code into ChatGPT to see if it could be improved. And one of the big things out here in Silicon Valley that you will hear is English is the new code, because these LLMs are generating code better than what we're seeing the engineers do, and so it's a question of being able to prompt a good software code rather than it is to know C, C or Ruby on Rails or whatever is the latest code. So Samsung's employees upload this code, ask it to improve, and then they're shocked when they discover that it starts, producing their own code to other people. How are we thinking about this from a compliance standpoint, from sort of data management? If this was something that was more private data, is this a breach at the time that you're uploading it into these public tools? Is it a breach at the time the tool starts spitting out data that it shouldn't be spitting out? Sean, can you talk a little bit about how you would sort of think about these sort of let's make it a hypothetical situation of employees putting internal confidential data into a publicly available tool? How do you think about sort of the risks there and sort of the legal complications that you're now facing?
And I think we have to understand the complete difference between, say, generative AI as an application or platform versus other more quote unquote conventional tools. For instance, say in the healthcare sector, maybe you were transiting or storing data, say in a I'd say a recognized data storage repository, if you will. Well, the reality is if it's there's a third party that hosts that data storage repository, you should probably have an enterprise business associate agreement in place, because there's always that possibility that third party will have access to that data, but it's otherwise secure. And when it's there, you don't have to worry about it that much. On the other hand, when you're talking about a generative AI platform, when the reason you're there is to have that platform, all the data, the patterns, the behaviors merge with whatever you're putting in there to make that better. Whether it's writing code, it could be audio, it could be video, and whatever directions you're providing it. And what it's doing is taking the other data there, making it better, but it's utilizing something from the outside, if you will. So you never want to put confidential data in that platform, because it's always going to have others accessing it, and ultimately it's going to find its way into the larger learning pool. I guess to use old school language, I guess the larger learning pool, if you will, of the deliverables. It's going to come out in ways that you can't even imagine, but it's going to be immediately available to others. And that's why one of the concerns about actually from an administrator perspective, to make sure you've got user policies, acceptable use policies in place to get a feel for, first of all, and as an employee, how are you going to utilize that, and to be restricted to some extent, making and from an information security perspective, making sure that we're sandboxing that platform, if you will, or accessing it outside our network. Because one of my biggest concerns is that if we see individuals actually trying to utilize that without in a place where it's not segregated from network use, and they're actually using confidential data, it's going to adversely affect at some point it will defeat your internal security controls, but also to the extent that you're putting it in a repository, and it's immediately going to be shared with others, and it's going to be a breach at the outset. Let's just say that's where my biggest concerns come from. Now, I do want to take a positive outlook and look at what that can actually do to drive better security when we look at those possibilities, and you actually fasten both information security and administrative policies and procedures in place to make sure that you've got good uses of that, and also good security controls on that. It can make us better, but if we're not careful, it could cause some serious problems.
And Beth, if I could add on that point, we've seen this rodeo before, and that's one good thing about being practitioners in this area. It's not so much different from an FTP server that was open and had anonymous controls set up on it. And you go, oh my gosh, it was really set up for a data migration process. People forgot about it. And now some bad guys are out there crawling, looking for nothing but open FTP servers. We also saw it with, maybe recall, we had a summer of the S3 bucket problem, where in the cloud, in AWS, a lot of people were forgetting to flip their bit to show that the data should be private instead of public. And then to Sean's point, you really got to stay out in front of this, because the only alternative is to try to make the argument, and good luck with this, that it was out there but nobody was able to access it. And do you even have the data that would show in a AI environment that nobody was able to access this data? So don't worry about it, no problem. It really starts way at the beginning. Are you putting good controls around it, and just don't let it out of the barn in the first place? And a lot of people who are new to AI don't realize that there's a big difference between open AI and these great tools that are available to everybody, and then the tools that are available on an enterprise basis, where you actually can lock things up, make them proprietary to you. Only, Jen, Beth, Sean, and Paul will have access to this system. You can put access controls around that. But that tends to be on the commercial enterprise tools, but not necessarily available on the tools that are just freely out there on the internet that our employees are probably using.
Right. I agree, Paul. I keep on hammering home to my clients, particularly those out here on the West Coast. Your employees are using these tools. If you don't give it to them in a secure environment, they're going to use it in a public environment. And so you need to be thinking through sort of this human element of training them on what they can use and the controls that you want to put around their use, but inside your systems where you can at least try to put your arms around some of the ways that these things can go wrong. Speaking of San Francisco, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco was out here last month at the ABA White Collar Conference, and she gave a speech about compliance and corporate compliance programs. And one of the things that she hammered home was that she expects that AI is part of your corporate compliance program, because AI can be utilized as a tool by your employee, and you should, to engage in fraud and other issues that the DOJ is particularly focused on, but also because AI creates new opportunities for things to go awry, and you should be predicting that and building, thinking about your risk assessments and building around it. Jennifer, I want to turn to you and bring you back in here to talk a little bit about what does it look like to think about AI from a compliance standpoint. What are the things that people in this room should be going and sitting down with their chief compliance officer or their CISO or whoever after this session and saying, we need to be adding this into our policies?
Yeah, I mean, we're very busy working on this exact issue with so many companies right now. Is they've either started to dabble, or they want to dabble, or they want to go full steam ahead, but they want to make sure that they're doing it in the right way. So it feels a lot like, when we think about privacy, like privacy by design. I feel like here everyone's really thinking, at the outset, how can we make sure that we've got all the guardrails in place? When I had my tech companies in the late 90s and the .com era, we didn't have all of these laws and regulations, right? We could kind of build whatever we wanted. Now, today, before you embark on any of these journeys, you've got to think about the laws first. And of course, I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm going to say that. But I think when it comes to a compliance perspective is to first think about, what laws may be impacting you. Now, we've got a lot of laws that are coming and some that have already come concerning emerging technologies, but that's where I would start. And if you look at, where the law is heading, globally and specifically too in the United States, a lot of it, just like cybersecurity, is really risk-based, right? What kind of data, what sort of tool are you building? Is it going to impact individuals, rights and claims and things like that? So looking at where the law is heading, and working with your, legal counsel and your information technology teams, senior leadership, to put that committee together to sort of understand, okay, here's the laws, here's our guardrails, this is where we think things are heading. And I'll say, in the US, we've got a number of states that have, already adopted laws concerning, automated decision making and things of that nature. And a lot of it, and I know this is an incident response forum, but I feel like we can't talk about these things without talking about privacy and AI, is, notice to individuals, whether it's employees or consumers, about the types of AI uses that you're embarking in, especially when there's solely automated decisions that can produce like a legal effect, right? Or a significant effect, whether to be able to get a loan or something like that. So giving notice to individuals, having a process for them to object or opt out, or have a human review the file instead of the machine reviewing the file. Looking at your risk assessments, is automated processing and profiling part of your risk assessment process? Your security questionnaires that you issue, the ones that you receive, right? Are you addressing automated decision making? And then again, and I think we've talked about it quite a bit, sort of that governance and accountability. Regulators see this as a hot topic, making sure that you've got the right policies and practices in place. I don't think you need an entire overhaul of all of your policies. I think it's taking your existing policies and building upon them. Whether, I think someone earlier mentioned acceptable use, right? Taking your acceptable use policy and adding a few more sections. Taking your incident response policy, adding a few more sections. So I don't think you have to start from the beginning. I think there's some real practical things that you can do. And as a lawyer, we always want to put our clients in a legally defensible position. Maybe you didn't have everything. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but at least you took some steps. So hopefully, after this session, you're going to meet with your leadership team to talk about, some steps that you can, with a compliance hat on, right? Some steps that you can take to do this in a thoughtful way, because we don't want our CISO and our executives to face individual liability like we've seen in cyber, right? We don't want, lawsuits and upset consumers. So again, I think you can just build upon what you have. You may need a few additional policies, but it shouldn't be that overwhelming.
Thanks, Jennifer. I completely agree. And that we have to sort of take this new lens here. I want to pivot a little bit to talking about the US regulators. So sitting in my firm, which is a global firm, all of my clients keep on asking me about the EU AI Act. And I keep on saying that's going to be easy compared to what's going to happen in the United States. Like, that's in one place, and you got a little bit of GDPR, and you sort of know what's going to happen. What we're seeing in the United States, a little bit like the way that, in the absence of federal government moving on a privacy laws, now we have however many dozen states with their own privacy laws that are not compatible with each other, that you're trying to thread the needle on. Similarly, without sort of a targeted AI regulation at the federal level, we're seeing two things. One, we're seeing some states move first. And then two, we're seeing the agencies, the federal agencies sort of start, using their existing tools actually at the direction of President Biden to try to regulate AI. And what that's going to make here is a very sector-specific, fragmented regulatory environment. And I do think that actually we're going to spend more time in the United States trying to help our clients navigate these complications than necessarily outside. But let's talk about some of the big regulators that are playing in this area right now. Paul, I wanted to go to you first on the FTC. And there's sort of two big things that I've seen coming out of the FTC. First, there was a leaked FTC CID to OpenAI. That was maybe the longest FTC CID I've ever seen. It had 96 pages. It was 100 and something questions. It spanned everything from their cybersecurity to the data that they got in, to the data they go out, the disclosures, and so forth. So that's one. And then second, they just issued a new rule around impersonation and sort of liability to upstream providers. Can you talk a little bit about where you see the FTC playing in this area of artificial intelligence and what they're thinking about in terms of cybersecurity and security generally around it?
Sure. And, I used to be an assistant manager at the FTC, and a lot of people forget that they have multiple missions. They're really a two-headed monster, and one big mission is obviously competition and antitrust, and then another mission is consumer protection and trying to make sure that the average person on the street is safe. What's interesting about is AI is we're seeing those pulled together, like in the OpenAI CID, leaked CID. They're obviously worried about competition. AI, by definition, has huge platforms, and they're worried that some of the small players might be elbowed out, including some of the cybersecurity players that need some of these big platforms in order to test their tools and things like that. So I definitely think there's even a cybersecurity antitrust component to what they're concerned about. And then, of course, they're concerned about the average consumer out there. And a little bit like we've seen in some other areas, like you said, sometimes the regulators are getting a little frustrated when the legislators can't get their act together. And the impersonation rule, I think, is a bit on those same lines. There is a bill that has been introduced. I know Senator Klobuchar was on it around impersonation, and it came after the Taylor Swift, the tawdry and obscene and disconcerting images that were posted, using her face, but then using AI to add sexually graphic materials around it. But the FTC, meanwhile, has already moved ahead with a regulation. And part of this comes out of not just, but it was good timing, I suppose, but it wasn't just the deep fake problem, but it was the problem with people calling you up and impersonating an IRS agent, which we've seen forever. People calling up and saying that they're your bank. I've had members of my family involved in this situation where they say, we think there's a problem with your bank, and then the bad guys come in and they will, quote unquote, monitor it for you. Well, they're actually just out there to steal your credentials. And the FTC saw this. Handwriting was on the wall. Their final rule came out in February, which is interesting, and this doesn't happen very often. They almost immediately went out with a request for a supplement to the rule, and it's focused specifically on AI, and that was triggered by some of these deep fakes. And so we all have until, I'm just checking my date here, April 30th, the end of this month, to submit comments on whether we think it'd be a good idea for the FTC to expand its government and business impersonation rule to include AI-generated images, video, or text. I think the takeaway when we're talking to clients about this is realize we're just at the beginning of regulation. We really just have 3 or 4 states, California and New Jersey have a chatbot law. New York has that employee law, and now Utah just came out with their more comprehensive law, but focused on regulated entities like nurses and chiropractors and things like that. But the landscape, like you said, Beth, is just going to get littered with new laws. And the FTC, I think, is just getting going. So the watchword is go hug your outside counsel, because I think it's part of our job is to watch these trends and be able to advise clients on it. And 2, always be mindful of the consent element, especially if you're dealing with consumers. That has to be riding along there in the background. A person wants to put out a marketing spiel. We've often received these marketing surveys saying, would you agree to be in this commercial? Or we just saw you walking down the street enjoying our product. We'd like to use your face and name. That's been going on for years. And now we probably have to add an AI component to it, because what if we take that person and put them in a slightly different position or in a slightly different context, and our marketing department is like, this is great, this is going to sell more XYZ, but it's now considered maybe surprising to that person who gave their consent. So I think consent is going to continue to loom large, if not even larger. And we're going to have busy days just trying to keep up with all the new legislation.
Thanks, Paul. I want to sort of bring in at these sort of last few minutes that we have our buddies, the regulators at CISA and at NIST, and talk a little bit about what they're doing. So, Sean, can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing at DHS thinking about when it comes to artificial intelligence and cybersecurity?
Sure. And CISA was one of those organizations. I know that Paul and I, after 9/11, we saw the rush of the U.S. government to develop these new agencies to protect our borders, to protect this or protect that. And oftentimes they were grappling to figure out what their role really would be and figuring out how to work with other existing federal agencies. And so at some point when I saw CISA, I used to call it CISA, but one of my teammates is actually from CISA. He is a former attorney advisor to Homeland Security for 3 years, so I've been well educated now about how CISA is actually pronounced as an acronym, but also what it does, and to become much more respectful of of what they can do and what they are doing right now, quite frankly, to better protect our internal infrastructure. But I was concerned about CISA when I first saw what it was trying to do, and I wasn't sure about its competencies. But what they are trying to do is really set an example out there. And we see it on a regular basis when we have certain matters in certain parts of critical infrastructure where we'll have a client contacted by CISA, and then we'll interact with them to get a feel for what they're concerned about. And I've been impressed so far the many times I've dealt with them in terms of what they're looking for, what they're seeing, how they're advising private entities to become more secure. And with regard to AI, what they're taking an approach to actually, as part of their mission, to example the responsible use of AI. And as part of their mission, to use AI-enabled software tools to strengthen cyber defense and support its critical infrastructure mission. They're actually implementing a secure by design software development model, which focuses on aspects of coding practices that increase the likelihood of a secure deliverable. I mean, they're really trying to do that in real time and encourage others that they're working with to do the same. They're actually looking at ways to assess how to mitigate the possible adverse effects of AI, and then recommend risk mitigation strategies across the critical infrastructure to make sure that we, with government agencies as well as private sector entities, to make sure that you develop, test, and evaluate AI tools in a very responsible, again, secure by design way. They're also contributing to policies and processes that can be incorporated into other government agencies as well as in the private sector, and actually doing their best to coordinate with international partners. So really taking a responsible, proactive approach. And then they're also educating their own workforce on AI systems, AI software, actively recruiting new employees with AI expertise. So really trying to take the lead. And I think what we need to look out for, what we can benefit from CISA, is actually looking for their guidance, recognizing that we don't, I never want to encourage somebody to put all their eggs in one basket or accept recommendations from one source. I want to make sure that we diversify our portfolios of information, if you will. But CISA has really taken, I think, a good first step in terms of setting the example for its workforce use, secure by design, and then making sure we're trying to establish best practices and share them across the industry.
Thanks, Sean. And Paul, real quick, I know that you work with NIST. Can you talk a little bit about what they're doing?
Yeah, quickly. January 2023, NIST came out with the AI Risk Management Framework. And if you haven't looked at it, please do look at it, because it's a great little checklist and starting point to think about governance and what are my risk factors. They lay out 7 or 8 different risk factors, from safety to transparency. Cybersecurity is embedded right there, so it is in our wheelhouse. And that has served as a very useful guide for me, and I think for many other people who are practitioners in this area. And then more recently, in February 2024, as a result of the executive order coming out of the White House, they formed the AI Safety Institute Consortium. And I and my firm, Manatt, are fortunate to be part of that. There's over 200 members from academic universities, civil society like Center for Democracy and Technology, large tech firms and platforms that are all part of it. And we've all been given, we've been broken into 5 working groups to talk about the framework that I just mentioned, to talk about content provenance, where is the data coming from, and how can we be more secure in that approach? What testing standards should we apply to AI? How do we go about red teaming? Concept we're very familiar with in cybersecurity. It's now percolating over, I think, helpfully into the AI space. And then finally, how do we model safety and actually mitigate risk? So stay tuned. They're just breaking into actual task forces within NIST, but we're going to see a lot more from NIST coming forward in the future.